And suddenly Dracula comes to you and he says, okay, I'm going to offer you a one-time chance to become a vampire. And then he says, it's going to be irreversible. You have to make a decision. You've got until midnight tonight to make your decision. So go back to your hotel room and think about it. And if you want to become a vampire, I will come to you at midnight. Leave your window open. Okay. So this is obviously very exciting. No matter what you think, probably a good idea to go back to your hotel room and think about it. So you go back to your hotel room and you start texting your friends. You call your mom and say, look, this is, tell them about this opportunity. And you say, what should I do? And as you start asking them questions, it turns out that they've already all become vampires. And this is surprising. I mean, I think it's right to say, like, Mom, why don't you tell me, right?
Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Those are lines from Robert Frost's poem titled The Road Not Taken. Indeed, you may one day find yourself at a crossroad in your life. You're possibly once again faced with a big decision, whether it is at work or in a relationship or shifting your ideological orientation. You play out different scenarios, what ifs and maybes. Deep down, you know that your choice will inform your experience. And based on the value of your experience, you may learn something new, grow, and transform.
Welcome back to the Soulspace podcast. We're your hosts, Adrian and Thal. On this episode, we explore the paradox of transformative experiences with L.A. Paul. Currently a professor at Yale University, Laurie's main research interests are in metaphysics, cognitive science, and the philosophy of mind. Laurie explains to us how many of life's big decisions, like having a baby or becoming a vampire, involve choices that cannot be made based on evidence or rational thought. We discuss the value of exploring these philosophical questions and the wisdom that can come from embracing uncertainty. Laurie is the author of Transformative Experience, Causation, a User's Guide, and Causation and Counterfactuals. We hope you enjoy this conversation. It is our pleasure to bring you L.A. Paul.
Welcome, Laurie, to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Laurie, we wanted to ask you, let's say you're at a dinner party with a bunch of non-academics and they asked you to describe what you do for work. What would you say to them?
I would tell them about the notion of transformative experience, which is something we've been working on. And transformative experiences are big life experiences. In other words, they're experiences that sort of change us, like how we think and make sense of the world and who we are personally. And I'm super interested in these kinds of experiences because I think, first, they teach us a lot about the world, but they also teach us about ourselves. And I also think that we can use them to construct ourselves, in particular when we're making certain kinds of decisions involving transformative experiences, what I would call a transformative decision. They're actually really important to us, and they form us and form our preferences in all kinds of interesting ways. So now I'm going to use an example. And one of my favorite examples is choosing to have a child, because that's an example where I think it's a big life experience. It's actually something that you have to undergo to really understand how it's going to change you, and that it does often change you, and it changes you in a very kind of permanent way. And so that's an ordinary example of a transformative experience that a lot of people will contemplate. Some people undergo it. And so it kind of gives people a grip on the sorts of ideas I want to explore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we were looking through some of the research you've done, I noticed there was an interesting convergence that it seems to overlap between, on the one hand, there's metaphysics that you're interested in, and on the other hand, there's cognitive science. I'd love to hear how you describe, first of all, what is metaphysics?
I don't know what metaphysics is. I'll give it a stab. This is something that's probably been debated, for a long time.
Right.
But very roughly, I guess I would think of it as it's an attempt to understand the way we think about what there is, which includes how we think about the external world, internal world. And it's a way of doing it that sometimes goes beyond the science, both the physical and natural science, as well as the science of the mind. And when I say it goes beyond, I just mean that some of the questions that metaphysicians explore just aren't things that admit of empirical assessment, or maybe they're more foundational in some ways. They're decisions or things you have to think about even to undertake empirical assessment. So it's not that there's just some answer you just go in the lab or whatever and figure out what the answer is. Sometimes you have to think about, well, what do I take causation to be? Or what is a self? Or, what's the nature of rationality? And you have to lay down some foundational answers to those kinds of questions before you can even kind of formulate an experiment.
These are very important questions that you're exploring in an academic setting. And it's the same kind of questions that we also explore in, like depth psychotherapy and depth psychology. And I'm just thinking about words that can be problematic, like spirituality and soul. And like these are all slippery words. So how can we talk about metaphysics without slipping into dogma on one side or just words that are not don't have a firm footing? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think it's easy to do that. The way that I approach it is by partly trying to proceed clearly and carefully, and then anchoring a lot of what I'm interested in to empirical work. So when I think about causation, what is causation? I might say causation is maybe very basically something that happens between events when one event brings about another event. And we can measure it to some extent when we think about dependence relations. In other words, well, if something hadn't happened, if the first event hadn't happened, then the second one wouldn't have happened. And we seem to experience causation in our life, so we can point to it in ordinary contexts and say, oh, look, when the bat hit the ball and the ball was hit out of the park, well, the bat hitting the ball caused it to go out of the park. When you play pool, like if you sink the 8-ball in the corner pocket, it was hitting the cue ball into the 8-ball at the right angle that caused it to sink into the corner pocket. And so when we start trying to use specific examples and also talk about things in ways that are related to measurement, that can help. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I think that can help is just to sort of anchor some of these discussions to the history of philosophical discussion, especially maybe for me over the last 100 years or so, but there's a much longer history, in contemporary Western philosophy of at least 2,500 years. And so kind of embedding these discussions in a richer context also helps to define them. Just using the words, like especially the way they get thrown around in ordinary conversation or in a metaphysical way, or in a metaphorical way, mm-hmm. I think can be unhelpful.
Absolutely.
On a more personal level, I'm curious where this interest came from for you. How did you end up in philosophy, and particularly these domains?
Yes. I've always been, I always wanted to think more about how we understood ourselves in the world and about the process of discovery and what I think of as epistemic or mental or conceptual revelation, like how we respond to new things in the world and discover new kinds of properties or new ways of being and make ourselves in various ways. Like I think this rushed in on me when I was in high school. I grew up in a, pretty vanilla, upper middle class suburban environment and didn't have a lot of experiences. And then what happened was when I was sort of 18 and escaped that environment, I moved to the city, and then I started discovering culture, and I went to university, and I discovered all kinds of ideas that I had never really had access to, and different kinds of people. And it was so incredibly exciting and amazing that I think that having that experience and having more and more of those experiences, like over the years that followed, made me feel that, well, this is something I need to spend my life understanding better. And there's a way in which I see a lot of people sort of have a grip on these ideas in an ordinary sense, but that they don't get studied much in the academy. And I want to study them in the academy because I think that's the way to deepen our grasp on the meaningfulness of these mental changes and understand how to use them, as I said, like in decision-making context, how to understand the role of rationality and discovery and learning in as precise a way as possible.
That's something I struggled with. My background is in English literature, and one of the things that I was struggling with at the time was that, okay, so here we are studying English literature, and but it's also about the soul. It's also about, and instead we're just drowning in critical theory and all of that. And so it sounds to me that you're reconciling between the world of like cognitive science and the metaphysical, which is a hard thing to do. And you're doing it in an academic setting. So when you're talking, I'm already seeing the connections between cognitive science, transpersonal psychology, and metaphysics. And it's just exciting. I don't even know what the question is, but I don't know if you have more to say about that.
So that's well spotted. So something that's going on, one thing that I have been doing, and I think not the only one, but not that many people have been doing, is bringing together, in particular, metaphysics and contemporary so-called analytic metaphysics, like the study of causation, the nature of time, what we take a self to be constituted by, right, and also a formal epistemology, together with cognitive science. And I'm doing that here at Yale. I'm doing it both by collaborating with people who work in vision science and social psychology and behavioral economics. And I'm also doing it in the classroom. Next year, I'm going to be teaching a grad level seminar with a vision scientist on basically temporal and causal perception, where we explore the metaphysics along with the contemporary cogsi in a very kind of robust, empirical, but also theoretical way. No one's ever actually taught a class like that at Yale, not even, and especially not at the graduate level. And I don't know if anyone's taught it anywhere, to be honest, in the world. And it's exciting to do it here because there are a lot of psychologists and a lot of philosophers and others who do a lot of research in related areas. And so it'll be, I think, a pretty exciting new cross-divisional graduate level course. And it also fits, and we're building actually quite special dual PhD program in the same areas. So in fact, it is, I think it's in philosophy, it's opening up to be sort of a new area of research in philosophy and psychology. It's Yale is opening up, I think, new areas of graduate study to do the research. And and we're doing all of that kind of at once together. There's more too. There's sort of some conferences planned and that kind of thing. So it's a new and opening up, I guess, area of research is the way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things that we struggle with, like in the transpersonal psychology field, is, okay, we're always arguing against the mainstream psychology, that here is transpersonal psychology is not quote unquote recognized by mainstream psychology, but there is a shift right now that's going on, and the fact that it's happening at Yale is so exciting for me to hear. So.
But I think you're right that the challenge is to try to be clear about the topics and the terms.
The terms.
And I mean, I view it as the philosophers teaching the psychologists and the psychologists teaching the philosophers at the same time. So as we're doing this, we're trying to kind of communicate, like new kinds of communication and new ways of understanding each other's work.
And I'm just thinking, like, at the root of it, and if we're going to think about sort of ancient knowledge, philosophy and psychology have always intersected, and it's really, psychology was born out of philosophy. And also, even going further back, I'm thinking about mystics and sages of different traditions have talked about the law of causation. I'm specifically thinking about a Sufi philosopher from the Andalusian time, Ghazali. He talked about causation and how sometimes it's not linear, and sometimes a cause doesn't produce an effect. So then what do we do? And again, this is showing up in quantum physics. So.
That's right. I think especially before the 20th century, most philosophy, Eastern and Western, basically, was tied to, if not mysticism, various kinds of faith-based orientations. Excuse me. And that was important, actually, because it was important to allow the mind to kind of range as freely as possible and explore lots of different avenues. And there are many ways in which you can allow the mind to explore freely. Limits on what you have to constrain yourself to, like what you can test in the actual world, what you can kind of materially kind of put your hands on. Although now I think if we blend those more historical perspectives with then the kind of contemporary focus on the empirical, you get a really interesting way to take bits from the earlier work and from the earlier ways of thinking, and then follow a line of thought, but then develop it maybe in an empirical way. So it's a new way to explore the older ideas that we find in some of the history.
Yeah. Laurie, I'd love to go into the weeds a little bit with regards to transformative experiences. And maybe for our listeners to lay a little bit of groundwork, I'd love to hear you explain the vampire thought experiment as a way to kind of frame these big life decisions. And I know I've heard you speak about these before.
And to go back to the empirical.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So one of my favorite thought experiments to illustrate first the idea of transformative experience, and then second, the way that can be important for big life decisions, is to think of a fictional case, because philosophers like to think of fictional cases. It's like idealization in physics. You take your ideal, you sketch an ideal situation, think about how to make sense of that, and then you move to the more real life case and take the structure that you isolated in the fictional case and see if you can apply it in productive ways. So I like to think about, imagine that you were somewhere in Eastern Europe exploring a castle, and you're down in the dungeons, kind of checking out all these kinds of cool, interesting, rather scary bits of the dungeon, and suddenly Dracula comes to you. And he says, okay, I'm going to offer you a one-time chance to become a vampire. And then he says, it's going to be irreversible. You have to make a decision. You've got until midnight tonight to make your decision. So go back to your hotel room and think about it. And if you want to become a vampire, I will come to you at midnight. Leave your window open. Okay. So this is obviously very exciting. No matter what you think, probably a good idea to go back to your hotel room and think about it. So you go back to your hotel room and you start texting your friends. You call your mom and say, look, this is, tell them about this opportunity. And you say, what should I do? And as you start asking them questions, it turns out that they've already all become vampires. And this is surprising. I mean, I think it's right to say, like, Mom, why didn't you tell me, right? Okay, so there's some surprise there, but then you start asking the questions, well, what is it like for you to be a vampire? Like, how am I supposed to make this decision? And as you ask them questions, they start telling you things like, well, it's incredible, it's amazing, you get all these, these amazing new sensory powers, strength, and fluidity, and you look fabulous in fashionable clothing. You can even make ugly clothing look fabulous. But there are some negatives. You have to sleep in a coffin. You can't move around by daylight without kind of a special thick sunscreen that's really awful to put on. You have to drink blood, or at least artificial blood. And you keep asking questions to try to find out more about like what it's going to be like, because if you want to do it right, the way that you would make this decision very naturally is to think, well, what is it like to be a vampire, and would I prefer to be a vampire to being a human? And as you say, well, look, tell me more about what it's like, what should I do? They start to say things like, well, actually, I don't think I can really explain it to you. It's, I can't really explain. There's a lot of things that are really hard to explain. Like I couldn't explain to you what it's like to see the color blue if you've never seen the color blue, and being vampires like that. But don't worry, it's amazing. It's, something that you can't understand until you become one. But once you do become one, you'll realize that this is only now does your life have true meaning. It's just nothing like being a human. Okay, so what are you going to do with that, right? You're basically told, it's going to be fabulous, but it's not something you can understand in the relevant sense. You don't know what it's going to be like until you actually become one. So should you just decide to do it? And I think that's the way, in other words, what's going on is that the vampire experience is, as I would put it, epistemically transformative. It's a kind of experience that you have to have in order to kind of fully grasp the nature of that experience. And it's also going to change you profoundly, right? It's going to change you so much that in some sense you're going to be a new kind of being, a new kind of person. Same thing, vampires are people, not human. But it's going to change some of your kind of core preferences, like what you really care about and how you want to live your life. Okay, so that's a transformative experience. And the problem is that if you're going to make this decision, right, you have to make it with this, in the absence of a certain kind of information. And in particular, you don't know what it's going to be like to be a vampire. All you have is a bunch of testimony from other people. And it's the way I described it, everybody thought it was fabulous. But if there were any naysayers, let's say some people who you talk to who thought, or, oh no, it actually didn't work out for me, but I'm trapped in this, then things get even harder, right? So if you have diverse testimony, then you can be in an even more difficult position. And there's something else too. And that is, when thinking about whether or not to become a vampire, if you just wanted to listen to the testimony or just sort of rely on what your mother said, there's another factor to take into account, and we can describe that as the endogeneity of the preferences involved. In other words, what if there's something about becoming a vampire that makes you want to be a vampire, right? So what if, in fact, there's a kind of Stockholm Syndrome that occurs, right? So that, of course, once you become a vampire, that biological process converts your preferences into wanting to become a vampire. But if that's the case, and it doesn't seem like that's incredibly unlikely, to be honest, from what we know about vampires, then the way that you evaluate their testimony is going to be corrupted, right? It's going to be affected in some sense. And if you want a real life example, if let's say that you were thinking about having children, but you actually decided you didn't really want to become a parent, but all of your friends told you, oh no, you might not want it now, but once you become a parent, it's going to be amazing, right? And so there's a question there, right? Well, maybe they're right, and maybe they're right. Maybe you would really be happy. But what's the ground truth for what makes you happy? Is it because right now you want to become a parent? Or is it just because there's something about becoming a parent that's kind of Stockholm-like, so that, the process of becoming a parent makes you also really happy to have produced the child that you produce? So I guess what I'm saying is the vampire thought experiment describes a certain kind of situation. It involves undergoing a transformative life experience. But it's a particularly difficult kind of decision because you don't know what you need to know in order to make the decision in a way that you ordinarily would if you were making an informed choice. So there's a decision problem there. How do you decide? And it isn't as simple as just evaluating the testimony, because there's this endogenous element that makes even the testimony sort of mysterious. So if you can't look within yourself and know what kind of process it is that how you're going to change in certain kinds of ways from the inside, and if the testimony is also complicated by that fact, how are you supposed to make the decision in an informed way? How are you supposed to do it rationally? Where I mean, like choosing a way that's going to maximize your expected value. And as I hinted, maybe even more than hinted, I think there are other life decisions like this, and choosing to have a child, in some sense, can really be like this. I mean, maybe you're not going to make it on, maybe you just want to have a kid because your parents did and they're for you and you want to kind of participate in this. But if you want to think about it in the way that I was describing, like, do I want this kind of life? Is this the kind of person that I want to become? There's a certain sense in which there's a kind of veil of ignorance that you kind of can't pull aside.
Yeah, it sounds like you're pointing at the limits of reason, and logic. Like, we cannot rely purely on those faculties to make a decision like this, or other, changing jobs or other identity changes that are dramatic. So how do you suggest people approach these decisions if that's not a reliable way?
Right. So I guess what I want to say is, I think we need to look at evidence. We need to look at testimony. It's very important to do everything that we ordinarily do. The problem is that we shouldn't think that that's going to give us the answer. And it doesn't give us the answer, not because we haven't thought hard enough. It's not like, well, just think a little harder, try a little bit more, read more information. Then you'll finally find that missing piece. I don't think it works that way. So I think instead you have to recognize that there are some things that language and testimony and other people can't teach us. And there are some things you just have to experience in order to know how they're going to affect you. And it turns out maybe some of the most important things in our lives are like this. So I'm not giving you an answer. I mean, it may be that there's a kind of humility and a kind of wisdom that we gain by recognizing, using rationality, using logic and assessment, and maybe even empirical information to discover that that's the situation we find ourselves in. And then there's a kind of acceptance and understanding that I think should come next. And with that, understanding other people and the decisions that when they have to make those decisions as well. I think this also ties to thinking about responsibility and blame and praise, and basically not blaming people in certain contexts when they make decisions when they couldn't possibly have known some of the details that they discover after they go through the experience.
This is like, what you're describing seems like it's a struggle for like our modern mindset, to have to make a decision despite the plethora of information that we have. I mean, every time I want to make a change in my life, the first thing I go is I hit the bookstore. But the truth is, the more sometimes I've been in situations where the more I've read, I was more confused, and that I had to just take that quote unquote leap of faith and just make that decision. And then going through the experience was the learning, and then whatever information that I collected was either confirmed or some of it was not. So
right.
Yeah.
See, I mean, it's in some ways it's a distinctively modern problem. So first, we're encouraged to think that various kinds of science are going to give us the answers. And again, I'm a big fan of both natural and social and psychological science. It gives us lots of information. But there's this, assumption that, well, we're going to actually get all the answers that way. And if not that, well, then if we just go out, there's so much information available to us, right, on the internet. And also just because now so much has been kind of recorded and written down, several hundred years ago, obviously, many people, they didn't have any access to the information, even if they had the ability to read and write in the way that they would need to. And so now we have so much available to us. There's this, I think, thought that, well, we have everything that we need somehow, and that we're only limited by our own laziness or our own inability to search everywhere that we should. And I think that's a mistake. Mm-hmm. And it comes from misunderstanding the way that we work as humans. There are some ways we get information that come from experiences and experiences alone. Mm-hmm. And understanding that, I think, really changes the way that we should think about certain kinds of things. You said, a leap of faith. Well, sometimes I do think, because experience is the only answer, you either leap into the experience, you either take it or you don't. Mm-hmm. And that's the choice. The choice is to discover what that experience is like or not. Let me draw a parallel that I find interesting. So there's a way in which, we can understand at a deep level that we can't understand another person's first-person perspective. We can, to some extent. I can learn. You can talk to me about your life. I can think about it. We can empathize in various kinds of ways. But there's another sense in which I don't know. I can't know really what it's like to be you, either of you. And you can't know in a deep way what it's really like to be me. There's a lot you can know, but you can't know everything. Okay. Once we understand that, I think then we can take that and apply that insight into thinking about who we might have been, or other possible selves of ours. So the problem of other minds, when there was really understanding someone else's mind, can come into play when you think about understanding your own mind if it were changed in certain important ways, like through these experiences. So, I have 2 children. The possible self who never had children, my children are 11 and 15, it's been a while. I can't jump into the mind of the possible person, Laurie, who never had children. She's just too different from me now. She's like another person. And I think recognizing that this thing we know about other people's minds can also apply to ourselves kind of helps put this other discussion into context about how, look, sometimes there's just some things that we can't know. And the wise response is to understand that and work with it and not try to pretend otherwise.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like that's, in some ways, understanding ourselves deeply helps us then, understand other people's minds to a degree, and
right.
and inform our decisions that are transformative, as you had mentioned.
I guess I would emphasize like understanding what we can know and what we can't know helps us to understand both ourselves better and also, that's right, other people. I mean, again, going back to parenting, which is a really, for me, useful example, it helps me to realize that there are things about my children that I can't know, and that this isn't a failure. I mean, it would be nice to know, I suppose, when I have to make decisions for them about their lives. As we get older, that's less important, but when you're small, there's a way in which you can't know, and you have to take chances, and sometimes you make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. It's just reminding me of a very sort of Zen thing, like the don't know mind. It's sort of cultivating being okay with not knowing, which is hard, and that uncertainty that, people have to learn to sit with.
Yes. Both epistemic humility, so a kind of humility in like what we expect ourselves and others to know, and then becoming comfortable with uncertainty, and not just uncertainty, but unknowability. So it's one thing when I walk out of a room to be uncertain about what scene, I might say, well, am I going to face a scene with some books in it, or with a computer, or with some trees? And I could be uncertain which of those I'm going to face, but know that those are my three options. It's a different kind of thing when I say, if I open the door, I don't know what's going to be out there. Right? So that's an unknowability. Like, let's say I could be opening a portal to another world, right? Let's go with the thought experiment. Like, that's a kind of a radical kind of unknowability. And some of what I'm most interested in involves basically, if not as radical as like opening a portal to another world, a certain kind of unknowability. Like when you've never seen color and then all of a sudden you discover what color is like. Before you've seen the color, you just don't know what it's like to see color. It's not about uncertainty in that case. And then you have to be comfortable even with unknowability.
I was just thinking, as you were talking about that, I was thinking also about, there are aspects to that, like, opening the door and looking at the unknown. There are aspects that are hard to quantify from our human experience, like fear, guilt, shame, like these things can be associated with a decision. And there are also gut feelings. Like sometimes, everything looks, you want to buy a house, everything looks good, but there's a gut feeling that's telling you not to buy that house. Mm-hmm. What can you say about that?
I think what I would say is, there's lots to say. One thing that comes to mind is just that feelings and emotions matter, I think, as much as the kind of facts about something. So I assign value to the nature of an experience, right? And so part of what I'm saying is that what it's like to live one's life after the fact, like the value that one assigns to it, should actually incorporate this kind of subjective character, the what it's like element. The other thing I would say is part of what you're talking about involves, for me, stuff about like motivation and trying, so it's one thing to know various kinds of outcomes, like you might know how to map out all the different outcomes and what weights to attach to those, like how likely those outcomes might be. And yet you might not be motivated, or you might be afraid, or you might have other kinds of emotions that come into play that would affect the way that you make the decision. And I think that's a place where rationality struggles, basically.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on using visualization? Is that sort of a reliable to imagine with your mind, using images or scenarios to imagine the home that you're contemplating to buy, and sort of watching maybe perhaps how your body's responding as information? How does that fit into sort of your model? Or
Good. Yeah. No, so I think, so there are lots of different ways we make decisions. And one way we like to make decisions involves a kind of visualization, like you imagine yourself in a situation. Sometimes what you're doing is putting yourself in that situation mentally and then trying to figure out, well, what should I do? Like, what are my preferences? Sometimes, though, in virtue of imagining yourself in that situation, you form your preferences, right? You might not even have had preferences until you actually are in that situation. The way this comes back, though, to transformative experience is that part of what I'm saying is that we use that tool often when we're trying to figure out what to do. But if you don't have the information you need, if you say, well, I want to decide, do I want to put on chroma glasses and be able to see colors in the world, or don't I? Maybe I'll find it overwhelming and frightening and and disruptive, or maybe I'll think it's fabulous. Well, you can't, if you've never seen color, you don't have the ability to imagine in an accurate way what that's going to be like. So you can't discover your preferences, right? So, and I think the same thing happens. Take somebody who's been in prison for 25 years, who's never used the internet, who's never used a cell phone. They're up again, and they go up to, and they're up for parole, and they have to go and face the parole board and describe how they're going to respond to and preparing themselves for various kinds of difficult situations to convince the parole board to let them out. There's a way in which we're asking them to do something impossible. Right? It's just, they can say things, and I think people do say things and get prepared, and hopefully, obviously they're well enough prepared to answer the questions. But I think often we're actually putting quite an unfair burden on this person, because the outside world has changed so much in ways they've had no experience. They can't possibly perform the right kinds of visualizations that they would need to be able to assess what they're going to face out in the outside world and make the right decisions.
Yeah, for some reason I'm thinking about Elon Musk and mission to Mars. It's like, if that was an option, would you like to move to Mars? That's one of those scenarios where you just you have no reference.
Yeah, exactly. Or I think parallel cases are, say someone is thinking about emigrating, right? And there might be political reasons or reasons why you were forced to leave, and so maybe you don't have a choice. But even then, there's it's a kind of opening a door to like another world, right? And people will go because maybe they have to. But if you're making the decision, maybe you have to make a choice between moving to a country that's very different from the one that you're in. Again, you face this sort of problem. Like, it's an unknown, really, how all the things you're going to experience and how you're going to respond, how you're going to change. And so then the question is, well, do I want to discover what it's going to be like? Or do I want to pass up that chance? Because even though there are opportunities there, it's also going to change me, and I value who I am now. And I think it can be totally rational to pass up the chance, by the way.
One of the main reasons we started this podcast was to sort of address or walk around the issue of the meaning crisis that we're going through right now. And we feel like your work around transformative experiences can offer an answer or a perspective to that crisis. Is there anything you'd like to speak to about that?
Yeah, so let me go back to, I've said a few things about revelation and what I think of as wisdom rather than truth. In other words, I think that first, recognizing that experience is something that we can use to learn about ourselves and the world. In virtue of having the experience, there's a way in which something is revealed to you. What's revealed to you is, in a sense, how you respond to the world, right? So when you go out into the world and see color for the first time, what you're really discovering is how you respond to various kinds of light wavelengths, fluxes, and things like that, and the way that you'll experience beauty, and what beauty is then for you. And I think parenting is like that as well. I don't think there's a right choice or a wrong choice with respect to parenting. And I think often becoming a parent carries as much suffering with it as joy. In fact, it probably carries more suffering with it than it carries joy. And the decision to undergo these kinds of experiences aren't simple calculations. And I don't think they're especially informed calculations when it comes to thinking about like pluses and minuses, or how much joy or satisfaction or sadness will you experience. It's just rather, look, this is what it is to live, is to undergo some of these experiences. It's not wrong to try to control them as much as you can, because you want to have a say over them, even if you don't know what's going to happen, even if there's both unknowability and uncertainty. So what you're seeking is a kind of discovery and revelation and opportunity, not necessarily knowing what the truths are and then judiciously choosing the ones that are right for you and rejecting the ones that are wrong for you. That sometimes is what we do, but in many other kinds of contexts, that's just the wrong way to think about the choices that we're making and the way that we're understanding things. And all of that then goes back to like philosophy, and going back to what we said in the beginning about natural, like empirical sciences. Like often empirical work is about uncovering truths, like uncovering like what the world is like in various ways and giving answers to questions. And philosophy isn't about that. Philosophy is about asking questions, discovering questions, and then sometimes recognizing there are things the way there are things that we can't know, or understanding like how we're supposed to kind of face and understand the place of a person in the world. And that's kind of what wisdom involves. So there's a contrast there, and there's balance, and I think that's fun.
Yeah, I'm reminded of our conversation with John Vervaeke, and he mentioned the term existential inertia. You know, there are these moments in our lives where there's this stuckness because it feels like you just can't get going or can't move, and it sounds to me, just hearing you speak, there's a wisdom in continuing to just keep treading, like to not reach a point of stillness where you're just not moving, and because it'll be really hard to get going again.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so I think that's right. That this goes back again in accepting unknowability and uncertainty, and not feeling like you have to act in order to create certainty, because sometimes maybe you do, but sometimes that's the wrong impulse. You know, instead of thinking that you must eliminate all the unknowns, you must eliminate all the uncertainty, you can just allow it to be. And then even when you do make choices, you don't have to think about yourself as always making the right choice, as much as just discovering basically a way that the world's going to reveal itself to you or evolve in various kinds of ways, and not thinking that we have to be in control in all respects of our lives.
What you're saying too is like, it really just goes in line with a lot of the mystical language that I've explored in my life. And, you know, just you saying that, just allowing and surrendering, and these are very important concepts. Sometimes we can't just tread along. Sometimes we just have to sit with the unknown, with the paradox, and just allow things to unfold.
Yeah, and I want to say it's not a giving up either.
Yes.
It's actually,
yes.
I feel like it's actually a way. I think people feel anxiety when they feel that they have to try to create certainties, and like just kind of being and not controlling is actually a way of a kind of establishing a kind of control at a higher level, and being at ease with the way that things change is a response that shows a kind of stability and a kind of understanding, and is in some ways the right way to approach the kind of anxiety of like all the different ways it seems that we're supposed to construct and control things.
Yes, I mean, it's so easy to talk about, but really anxiety is like, we're all struggling with it. And, you know, just... I'm just thinking like someone listening to this and like, okay, I will sit with it. but it really is about that, and, you know, trusting and allowing.
Yeah, and it's incredibly hard, and it can be really unpleasant.
Yes. Unpleasant.
Yeah, it's not like, oh, I'll just be uncertain and let it all sit and everything will feel wonderful.
Right.
No, I think usually maybe things feel wonderful after a while, or maybe you get a reduction of anxiety in some ways, but that doesn't mean there are unpleasant things to endure.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's part of the experience. I mean, it comes with the positive and it comes with the negative, and it's, you know, it's experiential work essentially. Right.
Laurie, what can you tell us about, we noticed the book that you're currently working on called Becoming. I feel like this is a good time to bring that word. What do you mean by becoming?
Right. Oh, I'll say that, although I don't think that's going to be
Become less
anymore.
Anxious.
That's right. No. Well, I mean, I do hope you become less anxious, but I don't actually know if that's going to be the title. I hate to say, especially because apparently Michelle Obama wrote a book that has that title.
Oh.
And so, yeah,
you're competing with her now.
Probably, yeah, I can't compete with Michelle. So, but it is about, and another title that I've sort of played around with is like, who will I become? And what I'm trying to get at there is, again, how we construct ourselves. Sometimes how we construct ourselves through making decisions to have experiences, and sometimes how we're just constructed by experiences. And I want to explore that in the book. So I talk about transformative experience, but I also talk about how, actually I talk a good bit about how embracing various ways in which we dispense with old selves and parts of ourselves, and new selves can surface, sometimes unexpectedly, through choices that we make or life experiences that we have to undergo. And sort of understanding that kind of ebb and flow of one's own kind of first personal perspective, especially over the span of a lifetime. That's the kind of thing I want to talk about. And the other thing that I spent some time talking about is how we often, I think, make judgments about whether we think it would be better or worse to be a certain kind of person. And I think when we make those judgments, sometimes they're good judgments, but sometimes they're born out of ignorance and a failure to remember that kind of self can really be impenetrable, and we have to respect, again, what we can't know about other people and about even who we could become after various kinds of experiences.
Yes, and with that judgment really is rigidity and, the black and white thinking, and it's not a good place to go to.
No, I mean, and again, it's not that, we can uncover certain kinds of truths, but there's a kind of humility that's really important to recall, and to say, well, look, I can think I know some things, but to assume that I know all the information that's necessary in these kinds of contexts when we're talking, especially about knowing other human minds and knowing other ways our own mind could be, I think it's just naive. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of self-change that can be so dramatic that you simply can't put yourself in the shoes of another version of you. Mm-hmm. If you think about yourself 15 years ago, for example, when I think about myself, I remember things about what it was like to be me then, but there's another way in which I really can't put myself back in those shoes from 15 years ago. I've just changed too much. And if I think about myself 15 years from now, or myself 35 years from now, I don't know, descending into dementia, right? Maybe not even 35 years, but let's not go there.
Yeah, no, that's black and white thinking right there.
But I think it's reasonable to say there's a way in which I can't both put myself in those shoes as that future self and still be who I am now. There's a kind of incommensurability in our mental lives that has to be recognized. And just assuming, oh yeah, I know enough about what I'll be like then to make choices for that future self with full knowledge and full certainty is just wrong. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't try to put that burden on ourselves, because that's the wrong way to approach the changes and the ways that life, the things that life bring us and the ways that we change our own lives.
Mm-hmm. I must say, I find your work fascinating, which takes me to the question I'm thinking about is, what philosopher inspired you or continues to inspire you, or what book that you've read that sort of transformed your life or changed your perspective? And is there anything you specifically would recommend?
So those are two different questions.
Yes, they are actually.
First, and Edna Ullmann Margalit is a political philosopher who wrote about various kinds of life changes, and she talked about opting, drifting, and converting. And there's a paper that I would recommend of hers. I'm also a fan of some of Cass Sunstein's work on related things about nudging and self-change. Those are, I think, interesting and useful things to read. The philosopher that motivated me the most, however, was someone named David Lewis. But Lewis was a technical philosopher. He wrote hard to read and hard to understand books, so you really have to be committed if you want to read David Lewis. And his work, in particular, he wrote a paper called What Experience Teaches, and he's written other work on decision-making and on the metaphysics of selves that I love. I guess if you could read Thomas Nagel's paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat, or you could read I think I'll stick with that. Yeah, a lot of my work, even though I've been talking about it in ways that I hope are accessible to non-philosophers, a lot of the work really is based on
academic
work in metaphysics and epistemology. My own book, Transformative Experience, was written for philosophers, although lots of non-philosophers have read it, and that makes me really happy. And the book that I'm writing now is actually written for non-philosophers. So my hope is that people would read that book to get a kind of a glimpse into some of the philosophical issues, and then if they were really interested, they could read like my philosophical book or work of other philosophers that I cite, or Newman Margaret's paper or something like that. I thought that would be the way that I would prefer to.
When you mentioned that title, was it How to Be a Bat? Is it?
Well, yeah, it's what is it like to? What is it like to? Yeah.
I'm reminded of Kafka's Metamorphosis and waking up as a beetle, and that's my literature mind. But I'm like, for me, to make those connections between the different fields is fascinating. So, yeah.
No, that's great. And actually, and in my my new book, I talk about a number of different works of in literature in particular, and connections. And I also, another thing you could read is you could read philosophical discussions of Plato's Cave, and how. Right. Which is an old dialogue where you have Socrates talking with Glaucon about being like people who are in a cave, who are chained and just looking at shadows on the wall, and they think they're seeing reality because they've never been allowed to kind of escape the cave, but actually there's a way in which everything they're seeing is an illusion, and it's. I don't want to say that the external world is an illusion or anything like that, but what I think is great about that example is that it's a way of understanding how what we see and experience is a reflection, in some sense, of how the outside world is affecting us, and that's I think a really good mental exercise to engage in.
Yeah.
One final question, Laurie, if you could say one thing to your future selves, what would you like to say?
I like that.
I would say that I need to pay attention to what I've learned from my past selves, to not forget about epistemic humility.
Awesome.
It was a real treat. Thank you very much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It was really nice to talk with you guys.
Thank you. Many months have passed with no tears shed. Those were the longest months. With dry eyes, you weaved a quilt out of mediocrity. You were voracious and tenacious in concealing the broken bits. But silly fool, the darkest parts are gold once slit. What now? How can one shed all 7 layers of dead skin? Every wince, every ache. Let your limbs speak, unfold, break the spell. It is easy to arrive. It is hard to arrive. Hold the tension.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Next week, we talk about psychedelic integration with Dr. Susan Scharf and Rebecca Hendricks. If you enjoy what we're doing and want to support us, please leave us a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear your suggestions for future topics and guests. You can let us know on social at SoulspacePod or info@soulspacepodcast.com. As always, thanks for tuning in. Until next time.